Thank y'all. It's hard to follow up, but I love being here, and I appreciate the audience, and I appreciate breaking convention because they break convention. I'm from the United States, and unfortunately, we don't often have such, let's just say, mature approaches to intercommunal linking up. I'll keep it that way. But my presentation today is a little different. It's called Wakanda Not Woodstock, Meetings with the Igun. And this is a story of death, rebirth, redemption, and rebuilding of communities using this technology. And I appreciate it. We're going to walk through it quickly. I have a lot to share. So we'll start off with the cover. Wakanda Not Woodstock. Woodstock was a cultural phenomenon in the United States. How many of you ever heard of Woodstock? All right. Yeah, that was the ending of the Summer of Love. It was considered a culmination of the psychedelic wave that hit the United States that pushed forth a lot of social change. Unfortunately, though, Woodstock was a commercialized thing that kind of made a mockery of the real people in the movement. And so the reason I call it Wakanda Not Woodstock is not a diss to those early luminaries, because they did amazing work, but it speaks toward the co-optation of their work and us returning to the proper use and application. Meetings with the Igun, it revisits the concept of our off-body ancestors. In traditional African cosmogony, the Igungun are our ancestors. And believe it or not, the Igungun are similar. If we consider the International Space Station, we are considered the space station. In other words, we have these biological bodies to deal with unnatural atmospheric conditions. The Igun are back home on Earth, and while we're in the space station, we communicate back and forth, and every now and then, we switch places. This is called the death and rebirth cycle. So if we think of life and death like the International Space Station, we're here in our astro suits, we're doing experiments, we're testing the environment, we're learning about the environment, we correspond back, we apply that knowledge, and we come back and get more. So meetings with the Igun, this is a very central point of my orientation with this work. And so once again, I was blessed to become familiar with the Breaking Convention 2013, thanks to my homie Darren and my teacher, Baba Kalindi EE. Many of us know of him, and like always, in our tradition, we always recognize our elders because this is the lineage. Baba Kalindi was very purposeful with his work, and I was honored that he kind of tapped me on the shoulder to help him with this. Why? Because from my land, I was coming from, let's just say, a traumatizing position. So this is the redemption story. I'll just go backwards in time. It was 1993. I was 17 years old. I was in the middle of my kitchen, all alone. My mother was living in the bottom of a bottle. Unfortunately, she had succumbed to like an alcohol addictive phase. My father had suffered temporary mental anxiety. Why? Because 2 days previous, my brother had been savagely murdered in the streets, and they had no clue about what happened. When they talked to the police, they said, "We have nothing." They said, "Why not?" They said, "It's an ongoing investigation." So without them having any context or knowledge, they basically mentally lost it. And I found myself, and this was the death phase. Why do I say it was the death phase? Because I came up in the inner city, Detroit, influenced by community, influenced also by peers. And I was a decent child, but I had peers, and when you roll with peers, sometimes you participate with them. Some of my peers, none of them were hardcore criminals or psychopaths. None of us were over the age of 22, but during the war on drugs, there was a beautiful tactic in which they would round up groups of black men in America. And the best way to do that is to call them a gang. They called us the syndicate, for nothing other than living in the same neighborhood. Now, some of us were, let's just say, on the underground economy, but me, myself, I wasn't. But that didn't prevent policing powers from moving swiftly and aggressively. So, month after this is the headline I had. So after my brother passing, all over the newspaper, police put the Ziploc crew in the bag. This is 28 of my childhood friends who had been indicted and given over 25 years in prison with little to no evidence. And this was the death. I've watched friends die, and I watched just about all my childhood neighbors and friends be incarcerated for 2 decades plus. I'm in a home by myself, and I realized something had to change. This began my journey to understand how to tap into higher self. Now, a little context, my father was highly rooted in sacred technologies and ancient Kemetic or Egyptian science, and so luckily he imbued me with a spiritual understanding about what was going on and how I could redeem this situation. I worked hard to redefine myself, and in 2 years prior after that event, I found myself in Senegal being initiated into a brotherhood, the Morite Brotherhood, which is a Sufic mystic brotherhood of West Africa, who used spiritual means to end colonialism in Senegal and Gambia, which is amazing. During this path, I became a community activist. Any of you ever heard of Black Panthers? Black Panther Party, Huey Newton? Yeah. Some of those people were like my uncles. And so I came up under them in the same liberation struggle. And many of you don't know, Baba Kalindi was one of those guys. He was very low key about it. But part of his job as a martial artist was enforcing drug dealers to pay taxes to local community groups. And so, oh yeah, it was a lot to this man. He was a righteous bruiser, as we say. He was the founder of Tamarian Institute, and this was designed as a self-defense institute and a cultural institute, which was designed to resurrect the spiritual, social, and physical power of our community through application of these sacred rites. So, as a martial arts institution, I'll break down the symbology really quick. Okay, you see the 2 arms that represent 2 aspects of the self, the hook and the flail. In traditional Kemetic cosmogony, one is to keep the realm, the hook keeps the spirit within the realms of reasonableness, and the flail keeps the physical body disciplined. And so through these sciences of balancing mind, body, and spirit, we would climb the Jed column, which is the column in the middle, also known as the chakra centers. We would climb the Jed column to ascendance, and then we would achieve what we call a state of balance, or aha. And from there, we would get illumination, i.e. the light. How do we get that? So if you look behind the glyph, what do you see? An inverted mushroom cap. So it was all signs and symbols. And it took years for me to understand what he was doing. So this process was a traditional initiatory process, which I didn't understand. How did it start? It started every Sunday. Baba Kalindi saying, show up at my house, ground rice, and cook. And Monday, we would train. And Tuesday, we would train. And then Wednesday, we would study. And then Thursday, we would train. And then Friday, I would hold space for people he sent to my house. And then Saturday, I would train. And then Sunday, I would cook. And this went on for 2 years straight. Didn't understand the method to the madness, but eventually I did. This led to us building a robust community in Detroit. At this time, Baba Kalindi was doing this for free, $99, because he understood a deeper meaning behind it, which I didn't. In his pouch, he would always keep the sacred mushroom with him, and I never understood what this was about, but I would soon find out. When I finally was able to partake, he challenged me to take what we call now high dose amounts, and the reason for high dose amounts was to break through the nominal self. This was part of me and us killing the dead self to resurrect what we call the Osarian principle, the resurrected one. So that's an example of the high doses we would like to take. And it was a beautiful thing. Those are some Tamarians. And that's a strain that Baba Kalindi worked hard to create from admixtures from Africa. So we went back to those traditional peoples, got spores and things, and worked to create a unique strain. One of the blessings about being with Baba Kalindi, he was like an Indiana Jones. So from Mali to Senegal to Gambia to Ghana, we traveled and we walked the bush and sat with traditional peoples, partook in traditional rites to learn the traditional way to approach this. And every single one of them would always tell us, you're not taking enough. And so we would go back and we would take more. And soon we would discover the why behind the what. I would. As many of us know who don't know, I'm from Detroit. what we know in the United States as a chocolate city. It's a city of resistance, rebellion, but it's also a city that has had its share of challenges, both politically and socially. If you don't know about Michigan and Detroit, it's one of the most segregated spaces in America, and we deal, believe it or not, with a lot of overt racism. And so because of that, we deal with a very, let's say, depressed population. In Detroit, the median income, let's just say 40% of our population is below the poverty line, and there's a functional illiteracy rate of about 50%. It was so horrible that we had to sue the state for the right to read. It took 2 years litigation. We finally won the right to read, which meant they had to provide our schools with books. And so this is the type of struggle that I come from. And so when I'm introduced to the mushroom, it was hard for me to just keep it as a sacred secret and go home and have fun and feel good while I see the people around me suffering. And so this was part of the work of Baba Kalindi, was creating a warrior society in the sense that we fight against those, what we call forces of opposition to our greatest self, okay? And so this is where the long work began. And so one day Baba said, because I was naming all these people who were interested in the mushroom, and he said, nope, nope, nope. And I said, why not? He said, I don't care about the number of people. We're looking for the right people. And it was an amazing thing because we would go into these sessions and we would find a person to approach. And we would approach that person, give them an experience, and they were oftentimes a thought leader and influential person in our community. This was the alchemy, and so I didn't understand what he was doing, but each of these individuals had a degree of influence in our community, and they each took this knowledge back to their circle and shared it with them. In other words, we were doing like a myceliated approach, an exponential growth of understanding in our community, and that's why he was like, we picked the right people. It's not about how many, it's the right people. And so we began to work with the right people, and so this is when I understood what he was doing, and this is what he was doing. He was teaching me the secrets of a sacred agent. In other words, he was teaching me about an invisible, let's just say, conflict that was going on. And he was teaching me techniques for turning on a people who were, let's just say, asleep, and how to utilize this sacred liminal space to draw down these energies to affect the people, okay? And so, yes, I call myself a sacred agent, 009, I guess, and so part of that means infiltrating groups, communities that are often turned off to such concepts and bringing them to the light, for lack of a better word, which means meeting them where they're at, which means I have to brown down or tone down my flowery language, right? They don't give a damn about chakra or kundalini. You understand? So I had to come with the language of the streets. And because of that, I was able to organize in places that other people were afraid to go, and we continue to do that. Yeah, thank you. One of the first secrets he taught me was how to contact the future selves or the elders or the Amma. And this was the reason that we would go into high doses. This was the first phase of what we call initiation in triple darkness, after 3 days of fasting and things like that. It was a 15-gram trip by yourself in the darkness. And the goal was to meet the elders and the Amma, and it wasn't an automatic thing. You had to see if you were accepted. And so this is why Baba would say, he said, I'm convinced that everybody who shows up doesn't get in, they just may stand around the lobby. In other words, when we enter these liminal spaces, there's pre-engineering that should be attained for the Egungun to allow you into the deeper understandings. And so that's so important in this context because we often get people who think we can get to spirituality by eating a few grams. But it takes the inner work beforehand. It takes that inner shadow work. It takes that, so all of this yoga, breathing, stretching, it counts for something. It creates the inner scaffolding to allow those energies to flow through you. If you haven't done that pre-work, you're gonna be in the lobby. And you're gonna say, yeah, I saw a purple giraffe doing backflips, And then when other people say, no, I sat with elders who did surgery on me and gave me secrets, they're like, I didn't see that. Well, you weren't letting the club, unfortunately. So I'm sorry about that. But part of this involves doing the sacred work, meeting with the sacred mothers, getting their permission. And once they get their permission, they were always guaranteed to work through me as long as I was honorable and did my homework when I came through, quote, integration. The rise of psychedelic tourism, I'm going through it kind of fast because I want to show how this work manifested. Around, I guess, 2005, it became the hip thing to do, you know? And so you saw titles like The Rise of Psychedelic Tourism, How Psychedelic Companies Can Deliver Exceptional Experiences. And, you know, for those of us who have been doing the work, we're like, what the hell? Like, how can a company deliver exceptional experiences? That's, you know, we rely on the medicine, but we would like to see. And so, but it didn't deter us, it just kind of concerned us because, as we know, capitalism culture, corporate culture has a way of commodifying the sacred or attempting to. And so we saw this as a trend that was beginning. But we also understood with this corporatization, commodification, there were going to be mass communities left behind, mass communities. So when I went back, I created Hood Noetics shortly after Baba Kalindi passed. Hood Noetics is one of our organizations. Now I can break down the symbology. Yes, that's a 45 record. The phallic-looking images is a 45 record converter, and it's a symbolic meaning of, you know, the melanated disc moving in counterclockwise rotation, producing vibrational sounds. This is a member who thought of this. Anyway, Hood Noetics was decided as a group that would deal with our individuals who are coming from the streets, incarcerated individuals, individuals that had a couple bullets in them, individuals who had seen death and such, some of the hardcore gangsters that they talk about. And because since I had access, we created Hood Noetics as an input, as a way, healing underserved urban communities through divinity. Okay, Hood Noetics. And so this was the first manifestation of how do I apply this sacred technology to my urban environment for people who aren't exposed to the higher teachings, per se, or philosophies. It worked very well. From there, I had a gentleman approach me who was a Purple Heart veteran who had seen the worst of war, and he said, hey, I have toad medicine, and I want to give it for free. And I said, okay, cool. You have toad medicine and get it for free. Now, while all of this was going, we were organizing on the legislative front, 3 of us, to have decriminalization in our city. And this is where it gets really weird because we had 3 people trying to organize a city of almost 1 million people. It took $80,000 and 60,000 signatures to get on the ballot, and we had no clue. This is where I went in on a high dose, and this is where the sorcery kicks in. I went in to talk with the amas, the elders. They said, we got you, don't worry. I said, we have 2 weeks to get this on the ballot. They say, don't worry. This is a perfect example. The end of the week, I get a call from a former state senator. He says, I have a well-heeled friend here who heard about psychedelics and he wants to have an experience. And I told him, don't talk to anyone but you. Within 3 days, him, his wife, and his business partner was in my living room and they were having an experience. Now, he came out of the experience positively impacted, a little bit egomaniacal. We'll talk about that on the sidebar. But immediately when he heard about the movement, he pulled out his checkbook. How much do you need? Alchemy. A week later, it was on the ballot, and our initiative passed with a 63% approval by the voters. This wasn't a politician push thing. And so local city council say, well, how the hell did you get 63% support on a ballot for drugs in a drug-ridden city? Ancient African secret, my friend. So, I see there's a couple slides that I'm missing, but we'll go into some of the other projects. So after the establishment of the Proposal E, which effectively decriminalized in our city, I began organizing nationally, and on the state level, we were able to flip 5 cities in my state and over 15 cities in the United States, and a decriminalization model. So those of you that were in in the drug policy talk, and you heard me asking questions, is simply because I do the work. You understand? It wasn't me just throwing darts, but when I ask critical questions about the purpose of legalization and its role in increasing enforcement as opposed to liberating people, we have to be serious about that. You know, because as soon as something is legal, something and someone is illegal. and therefore you need people to enforce the legalities. So sometimes legalization sounds cute, but does it enforce state power over our decisions? Oh, a whole nother debate. We're not gonna go there. Anyway, from there, we developed a community-based program for mothers and parents who were dealing with parental stress. I had a slide describing it, but I'll do it verbally. We do a bi-monthly series called Ready, Set, Let It Go. I call it Ready, Set, Let That Shit Go. And we deal with parents who are dealing with parental things. So we're dealing with our prisoners, we're dealing with our parents, we're dealing with our veterans. And from there, of course, we had people who are interested in doing the work. So I had me and my comrade, Shan, we created in our institution the Kalindi mycology lab. And so here we are able to train community members on how to test the potency of mushrooms for safety purposes and for understanding. So we test psilocybin, we test lion's mane, and we test cordyceps, and we're right now getting more standards. And we're training people to do lab-based analysis of mushrooms so they can figure out the constituents and how to solve their own problems. Citizen science on another level. The reason that this is so important is because we have to remake who we conceive we are as human beings. And for those of us that have deep roots in this understanding, part of our job is not to be insular, not inward-facing, but outward-facing. Part of us is to translate some of this very high, complicated language and understandings into common person's language. And more importantly, our job as conduits is to make sure that that connection between heaven and earth stays clean. So when people come behind us, we are the ambassadors. And the impact of their trip is very much based on the person who introduces them to that realm. In other words, if you're an unscrupulous individual and you bring somebody into that realm, the realm will receive them as an unscrupulous individual. I know it sounds deep, but we are responsible for the people around us. It's time for me to stop. However, I thank y'all for the audience. I thank y'all for being here. Let's talk afterwards. Peace.